I watched them pour concrete on my land, and I said nothing. 12 massive commercial buildings rose up, one after another, while the HOA smiled, signed contracts, and acted like they owned everything beneath their feet. Neighbors thought I'd lost. Some thought I was scared. Others thought I didn't know my rights. But silence was never weakness. Every beam they lifted, every wall they finished, only tightened the trap. Because while they were rushing to cash in, I was holding something they never bothered to check. A single document, a single line of ink that could erase months of work and millions of dollars overnight. The day I finally spoke, the room went quiet. And when I placed that paper on the table, the people who tried to take my land realized too late they had built their empire on a mistake. So what happens when an HOA builds everything on land they never owned, and the real owner decides to stop playing nice? Before all of this happened, my life in that community was quiet, almost boring in the best way possible. I didn't move there to fight anyone. I moved there because the land had been in my family for decades, long before the signs, the gates, or the glossy HOA welcome packets ever existed. It was a stretch of property on the edge of a growing town, open space, clean air, and enough distance from neighbors to feel like you could finally breathe. I used part of it for storage, part of it sat empty, and part of it I planned to develop someday when the timing felt right. At the time, the neighborhood was changing fast. What used to be a handful of homes and quiet roads was suddenly attracting investors. New houses went up almost overnight. Then came the HOA. They arrived with polished boards, printed rules, and the promise that everything would be better managed now. Property values would rise. Order would replace chaos. And at first, I didn't mind. I paid my dues, I waved at neighbors, I kept my land clean and stayed out of everyone's way. I wasn't looking for trouble, and trouble wasn't looking for me. Or so I thought. But slowly, things started to feel off. Survey crews began walking near my property line without asking. Trucks parked where they never used to park. One afternoon, I noticed small colored flags pushed into the ground, bright, harmless-looking markers that didn't belong there. When I asked a worker what they were for, he shrugged and said, "Development plans, HOA stuff." That was the first time my stomach tightened. I checked my mailbox more carefully after that. HOA newsletters mentioned future commercial improvements and shared use expansions, written in language so vague it felt intentional. No one said my name, no one said my land, but the maps in those pamphlets came a little too close to my boundaries. Still, I told myself not to overreact. HOAs loved paperwork. They loved talk. Half the time, nothing ever came of it. And besides, I had all my documents in order. Deeds, surveys, records older than the neighborhood itself. I knew exactly what I owned. Or at least, I thought they knew too. Weeks passed, then months. More trucks, louder machinery. One morning, I woke up to the sound of heavy equipment idling just beyond my fence. When I stepped outside, I saw stakes driven deep into the soil, straight lines, measured spacing, the unmistakable outline of something permanent. I called the HOA office. No one answered. I emailed. Automated reply. When I finally spoke to a board member at a community meeting, they smiled and said, "Don't worry, everything's been approved." Approved by who? That's when I realized something important. They weren't asking permission anymore. They were acting like the decision had already been made. Neighbors started whispering. Some assumed I'd sold the land. Others thought I'd partnered with the HOA. A few avoided eye contact altogether, like they didn't want to be caught in the middle of whatever was coming. And standing there, watching the lines being drawn into my soil, I understood one thing clearly. This wasn't a misunderstanding. This was the beginning of a fight they thought I'd never be able to finish. Once the stakes went into the ground, Everything changed. The HOA stopped pretending this was a conversation. Overnight, official notices began showing up in my mailbox. Thick envelopes stamped with warnings, deadlines, and language designed to sound final. They claimed the land had been reclassified under Community Development Authority. According to them, the area I'd owned for years was now part of a shared commercial zone, approved by the board. No vote, no consent, just a decision. I drove straight to the HOA office with my survey maps in hand. The receptionist wouldn't let me pass the front desk. She smiled the way people do when they've already been told what to say. "You'll need to submit your concerns in writing," she said, sliding a form toward me like this was a parking complaint, not the seizure of my property. By the end of that week, the machines moved in. Bulldozers carved through soil I used to walk every morning. Trees that had stood there longer than the HOA itself came down in hours. Every crash of metal felt personal. I called the county. They told me the HOA had submitted permits. I asked to see them. They said I'd have to file a request. And while the paperwork crawled, the construction sprinted. Then came the fines. The HOA cited me for interfering with approved development because I stood near the site taking photos. Another fine arrived for unauthorized signage after I posted a small notice warning contractors they were building on private land. They fined me again for disruptive behavior when I tried to speak to the project manager. Each fine came with late fees attached automatically, like they expected me not to pay. Neighbors stopped waving. Some whispered apologies, others avoided me completely. A few repeated the HOA's line, "If they're building there, they must have the rights." Doubt spread faster than truth ever does. I started questioning myself. Late at night, I pulled out my documents again. Old deeds, yellowed surveys, handwritten boundary notes from my father. Everything was clear. The land was mine, always had been. But the more certain I felt, the more aggressively the HOA pushed back. They sent a cease and desist letter accusing me of harassment. They threatened to suspend my community privileges. Then came the letter that made my hands shake, a notice of lien for unpaid fines that didn't even exist yet. That's when I realized they weren't trying to win legally. They were trying to exhaust me. Meetings were worse. HOA board members spoke over me, using polished phrases and legal-sounding jargon. Community benefit, economic growth, minor boundary adjustments. When I tried to object, they cut the mic and moved on to the next agenda item. And behind the scenes, the buildings kept rising. Concrete foundations were poured, steel frames went up, walls followed, 12 structures in total, each one locking the mistake deeper into place. Contractors worked fast like they were racing a clock only I could hear. I could have gone to court then. Everyone told me to. Friends warned me. Even a lawyer I spoke to casually said, "You need to act before this goes too far." But something didn't sit right. The HOA was too confident, too careless. They hadn't even tried to negotiate. So I waited. I gathered evidence quietly. Every notice, every fine, every email. I recorded conversations. I photographed progress daily. And most importantly, I requested one document the HOA assumed I'd never see. The original land transfer and zoning authorization they claimed gave them control. Weeks passed before it arrived. When I opened it, my heart started pounding. The authorization referenced a parcel number that wasn't mine. They had built everything on the wrong land. And suddenly, their urgency made sense. The speed, the pressure, the intimidation. If they could finish construction and establish use, they could argue possession later. They were betting I would panic. Instead, I smiled, because now the question wasn't whether I owned the land. It was how long I'd let them keep building before I showed them exactly what they'd done wrong. The day I decided to end it didn't start with anger. It started with an invitation. A certified letter arrived announcing an emergency HOA board meeting Mandatory attendance requested. The subject line read, "Final resolution of ongoing interference issue." They weren't even hiding it anymore. They thought this meeting would be the moment I backed down, or got buried under paperwork and threats until I stopped breathing. The room was packed when I arrived. Board members sat at the front like judges. Their attorney was there too, briefcase open, legal pads stacked neatly. Neighbors filled the chairs behind me, whispering, watching like this was entertainment. On the screen behind the board was a slideshow titled Community Commercial Expansion Phase Completion. 12 buildings, finished. The HOA president smiled as he spoke. He talked about progress, about shared prosperity. Then his tone shifted. He accused me of obstruction, harassment, and spreading misinformation. He listed fines so large they made people gasp. And finally, he said it. Effective immediately, the HOA will be enforcing removal of all claims to this parcel. That's when the attorney slid a folder toward me. I didn't open it. Instead, I stood up. The room quieted, confused by the calm in my voice. I thanked the board for the invitation. I thanked the neighbors for coming. Then I asked one simple question. Before we continue, can you confirm which parcel number you believe you're discussing? The attorney answered without hesitation, confident, smooth. I repeated the number out loud, slowly. Then I reached into my bag. I placed my folder on the table and opened it wide enough for everyone to see. Inside were county-certified documents, original deeds, surveys, and a land record stamped and signed decades before the HOA ever existed. I turned the page. The parcel number didn't match. A murmur rippled through the room. I explained it clearly, calmly. The HOA's entire development, every foundation, every wall, every business lease sat on land that never transferred, never rezoned, never authorized. My land. The attorney leaned forward, asked for copies. The HOA president's smile cracked. Someone on the board whispered, "That can't be right." So I clicked my remote. The screen behind them changed. A county zoning officer appeared, live video call, prearranged. He confirmed it publicly. Parcel mismatch, unauthorized construction, no grandfather clause, no shared use loophole. The room exploded. Neighbors stood up, voices overlapped. Someone shouted about taxes. Someone else asked who was responsible. The attorney went pale. The HOA president tried to regain control, but his microphone cut out mid-sentence. Then came the final blow. I revealed the notice I'd filed that morning, an immediate cease and desist, accompanied by a formal demand for remediation or compensation for illegal use of private land, backed by county enforcement, backed by state law. The board members stared at me like I'd just changed gravity, because I had. Everything they built was now a liability. Every day those buildings stood there, they owed me money. Every lease they signed was voidable. Every fine they'd issued me, illegal. I looked around the room one last time. You rushed because you thought I'd fold. You rushed because you thought ownership was something you could vote away. I closed my folder, but you never owned the ground you were standing on. Silence fell heavy and final. And in that moment, the HOA realized the fight they tried to win with power was about to cost them everything. Because now, the law was on my side, and the bill was coming due. The fallout didn't take days or weeks. It took hours. By the time that meeting ended, the HOA attorney was already on the phone with county officials, his voice low and urgent. The board members who had spoken so confidently just moments earlier now avoided eye contact, shuffling papers like they could rearrange reality. Neighbors filtered out in silence, the shock still settling in. No one argued anymore. There was nothing left to argue. Construction stopped that same afternoon. County inspectors arrived before sunset. Red tags were slapped onto doors that had been unlocked for less than a week. Unauthorized development notices went up where glossy business banners had been planned. By morning, news of the halt had spread through the neighborhood faster than the HOA ever could. And this time, the rumors were true. Within days, formal letters replaced the threatening notices I'd grown used to. The tone had completely changed. No more fines, no more warnings, just carefully worded requests to discuss a mutually beneficial resolution. The HOA that once refused to answer my calls suddenly wanted meetings, plural. The legal reality was brutal for them. Because the buildings sat on my land, they had two options: remove everything and restore the property, or negotiate compensation for continued use. Demolition would cost millions and invite lawsuits from tenants who'd been promised space that never legally existed. Walking away wasn't an option. They chose to negotiate. What followed wasn't fast, but it was final. Lawyers reviewed every square foot, every permit, every signature that never should have been signed. The HOA's insurance refused coverage due to gross negligence. Board members resigned quietly, one by one. The president, who once threatened to erase my claims, stepped down for personal reasons before the month was over. The settlement reflected the scale of their mistake. The HOA purchased the land from me at a premium far beyond market value, covering legal fees, back taxes, and damages for illegal use. Additional funds were set aside for community repairs and to compensate homeowners whose dues had been misused to bankroll the project. The lien against me was voided. Every fine was erased. And then came the apologies. Some were awkward, some were sincere. Neighbors who doubted me stopped me on the street to admit they'd believed the HOA because it was easier than questioning authority. Others thanked me for standing up when no one else felt like they could. A few quietly asked for advice on reviewing their own property documents. The neighborhood changed after that. The HOA still existed, but it was no longer untouchable. Rules were rewritten. Meetings became transparent. Legal reviews were mandatory before any future development. Power shifted away from blind trust and back toward accountability. As for me, I didn't celebrate loudly. I walked my land again, quietly, the way I used to. The buildings were still there, but now they stood as reminders, not threats. What had once felt like an invasion now felt like proof. Proof that patience can be stronger than panic, and preparation can outlast intimidation. The biggest impact wasn't the money or the victory, it was the lesson. HOAs, boards, and institutions often rely on one assumption: that individuals won't fight back, that they'll get tired, confused, or scared long before the truth catches up. They count on pressure, on silence, on the belief that authority equals correctness. They were wrong, because ownership isn't a suggestion, it isn't a vote, and it certainly isn't something you lose just because someone louder says so. If there's one thing this experience proved, it's this: sometimes the most powerful move isn't stopping them right away. Sometimes it's letting them finish and then showing them exactly what they never had the right to build.